Jeetu Patel, Executive Vice President and GM, Security and Collaboration at Cisco. Welcome to the program today.
Thank you for having me, Joe. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm absolutely looking forward to it because there's so many wonderful things we can sort of unpack here. The focus of today's discussion is really around the battle and the future of hybrid work and AI in the workplace. Clearly, they are intertwined, but I think initially I'd like to sort of break them out and talk about them as two separate concepts, but we'll clearly have them come back together in the not too distant future. All right. Before we go down that direction, I would love to hear a little bit more about your background and what led you to your current role at Cisco.
A lot of luck. They'll hire anyone these days.
Sure.
I started my career in a market research firm that I ran for about 17 years in Chicago, and then decided that I really was fascinated with scale and getting something built that could be used by, hundreds of millions of billions of people. And I think software is one of those magical things that when you build it once, you can actually have many people use it. And so I decided to move to the Valley. I joined EMC and ran I ran their file sharing and collaboration business over there eventually, and that competed with Box. We then carved out that business because Dell was buying EMC. I decided, hey, let me try something else. And Box at the time was just figuring out how to become a multi-product company. I joined Box. Aaron Levy is a good friend, and from there, Cisco came about as something that was completely not planned. Chuck reached out and said, hey, would you be interested in running two very different businesses, collaboration and security at the time? They were making the transition to a recurring revenue business, and they needed someone with a SaaS background, which I happen to have. And so I've been here for 3 years, and it's been a ride of my life. It's been a lot of fun.
Well, it sounds fantastic, and that's quite a pedigree there. I don't think it's all luck, but I know what you're saying in general. So that's fantastic. All right, so we are almost at the technical end of summer. After Labor Day, everyone's back to work, back to school, all those fun things. And in the news, it's a bit buzzy, but companies have renewed their invitation request, nay, demand of employees to come back into the office. I know Meta and Amazon are both in these two camps. Amazon, which has HQ2 in the DC area in Arlington, Virginia, is now checking badges such that people are actually coming in a minimum 3 days a week. Where do you think all of this will land going forward? Are we really going to move back to the era of 2019, or you think that's gone for good?
Well, I hope for the sake of humanity that we don't revert back to exactly the way that things were, because I think you'd leave a lot on the table as far as opportunity creation for people, where geography doesn't become the main determinant of access to opportunity, And so I understand the need for saying, hey, we need to have some kind of in-person communication, because sometimes video leaves a little bit more to be desired. We are actually working very hard on those kind of problems in our video offerings in WebEx. And I can talk a little bit about that. But I personally feel like mandates aren't going to work. I think what you have to do is create more of a situation where you could make office a magnet where people want to come in, because there are certain things that an office delivers in an in-person setting that maybe can't be delivered elsewhere. And so you have to create that scenario where you want to have people come in. But I'm not a big fan of mandates. I actually feel like, and then the other thing I'd say is the reason I feel it would be regressive for society to go back to pre-COVID days is, opportunity is pretty unevenly distributed throughout the planet, but human potential isn't, and if you start thinking about the access to opportunity, it's been largely dependent on geographic presence. But it would be nice if someone in a village in Bangladesh had the same access to opportunity as someone in the heart of New York City or in the heart of Silicon Valley. And it should be based on potential and skill, rather than geographic presence. And so I think what COVID allowed us to do is experience that for a moment of time. And I think reverting back to saying you have to physically be present, once again, kind of constrains the amount of opportunity that humans have. And so I hope it actually is something that the future becomes more hybrid. And I think every indication right now is that it's going to be where there's going to be a mixed mode of working. Sometimes people will work in the office. Sometimes they're going to work at home. Sometimes somewhere in the middle. People have different kind of distributed workforces. And I think that's going to be better. The thing that we are struggling with right now is that hybrid doesn't work as well as any of the two previous modes. Hybrid doesn't work as well as when everyone was in the office, nor does it work as well as when everyone was remote. And that's the thing that we have to solve collectively. And the reason it doesn't work well is because there's an inequality that happens with people that are together versus the ones that aren't. And you have this kind of primary and secondary class of participants in a meeting. And I think what needs to happen is you have to take away those barriers, both culturally as well as technologically, to make sure that people can actually not feel the distance when they're in mixed mode. And there's a lot of ideas around that we can talk about if you so choose to go down that path.
Yes, I think that makes perfect sense. In just a second, I think I've been in the same situation as that you're describing. I mean, you're in the office with a group of people, and the rest of the people are either on video conference or are just literally on a conference call, and they are almost forgotten most of the time. Oh yeah, wait, there are people right there that you just haven't brought into the conversation. So very important. All right. So leading down the path of what you just described, it almost sounds like the democratization of technology is an important piece of this. So we're talking about someone that's in Bangladesh has tons of talent, but maybe they don't have access to these types of things. One significant impact that I've been talking about for probably too long, and we're finally starting to see the fruits of the labor that people are putting into this sort of stuff, is VR and MR. So virtual reality and mixed reality in the coming years, which, in my personal opinion, will definitely have an impact on remote work for people globally. Of course, Apple comes out with Vision Pro, and the developers are sort of testing and playing around with that right now. I was an early adopter, for better or worse, of Google Glass. Magic Leap has been working on this sort of problem for, I dare say, 7 or 8 years now. How does all of that tie into what you all are working with respect to WebEx and this whole ecosystem of bringing people further immersed into this environment?
It ties in very closely, and we're big fans of Vision Pro, and I think it's probably one of the most consequential technologies that has been built by Apple. And I just don't think it's hard to describe it without having experienced it. But once you've experienced it, you gain religion around it very quickly. And so the way that we think about it is, making sure that our goal is to make sure that technology disappears and two people feel like they're right there with each other, even though they might not be physically. And I think there's no better example of that than what Vision Pro does, because other than, in my experience, having seen the demo at a very detailed level, other than the sense of touch or smell, everything else feels like you're right there.
Remarkable.
It's completely the most amazing thing I've ever seen as far as a piece of innovation by a company. Yeah.
Fantastic. How do you see WebEx moving forward in this direction? Are they going to be leveraging these types of pieces of hardware, which are going to be coming out in all different areas, or is there a different type of interface that you're going to go down the road with?
The way that we think about it, WebEx, is we are a company that makes our own hardware and software, and we work with others that make really good hardware. And Apple is a great partner of ours. And so we are very committed to making sure that any device that Apple has that create better immersion of experiences, we will be, the first to kind of double down on that. And we are doing that with Vision Pro, and we feel like it's going to create experiences that previously were not thought possible. And it's everything from the 2D experiences all the way to the 3D experiences. But on the 2D experiences, having an infinite canvas solves so many problems, because it's not just around problems being solved around, I don't have enough room on my desk, and so I can have this, big infinite, screen where I can look at things in a much more easy way. But what it also does is make sure that the as you get from 2D to much more of a kind of a 3D approach, you're able to go out and have things that feel as though you're right there. Because the two-dimensionality actually doesn't allow you to create the kind of things that you can do in 3D. But what they've done is they've actually given you this kind of beautiful blend of all of that needs to happen. So we feel very excited about working over there, and WebEx will be one of the key, they'll be one of the key partners where we'll actually continue to invest in their platform. And we've done that with the iPhone, with the iPad, with the Mac OS, and the Vision OS is going to be very similar. We'll continue to keep investing in that.
Fantastic. So thinking about something that's sort of near and dear in my heart, and that's security. It's a top concern for all companies. You look at surveys for the CEOs, the C-suite basically say this is probably one of the most, if not the most important things that people need to consider. You have people working remotely all over the world, hybrid environments, networks, applications, user administration, IoT, soon to be, and actually now, AI generated scripts and content, all sorts of things, right? So how do we better solve for what seemingly is an enormous albatross around most people at organizations, whether it's SaaS model, cloud, all these things intertwined? How do we solve for this to make it just easier for people not to have to worry about these security concerns?
The really interesting part about this is the way that we think about this is security and privacy and connectivity are basic human rights.
Yeah.
Because it allows people to, make the world better, make the world function, do things in a way that feels safe and secure. And the challenge that we've had, so if you assume for a moment that hybrid work is here to stay, that has exacerbated the problem of security for a moment, because what it does is you might not always be on a secure network. You might not always be on a managed corporate device. But when you access intellectual property, when you're thinking about going out and doing something that is confidential, you don't want the world to know, it's extremely important that the infrastructure allows you to stay safe and that it honors your privacy. And so we've been thinking long and hard about security, and what we found in security is that it's coming to this inflection point right now where it used to be that innovation in security happened largely as patchwork. What do I mean by that? That means that every single time there was a new threat, there was a new company that emerged to go out and solve that threat. Consequently, there's been about 3,500 vendors in the market. On average, most companies will have 50 to 70 vendors in their cybersecurity stack. And it's physically gotten to be untenable. And what's happened is the adversaries and the bad actors are winning. And the reason they're winning is because they have this inherent asymmetry in their advantage. And that is they have to be right once,
right?
But a defender has to be right every single time, right? And so that's the problem that has to get solved. And so what we see is a movement happening now of saying, rather than going into this world of point solutions where you have a bunch of these different kind of technologies, which just compounds the complexity of managing a security infrastructure, we're seeing a move to more of a platform that says there's going to be a handful of platforms that can actually share telemetry across multiple different points of what we call control points in security. So if you have an email and access to the web and an endpoint and the network, these are all control points. If there's a way that you can share telemetry across them, you will just have a better chance of catching a breach, because a breach can only be found today at machine scale, no longer at human scale. And so I think security is going to be a very large kind of contributor to the way that we solve problems of safety for humans. And it is part of critical infrastructure that impacts other critical infrastructure. So if you have a security breach, your power line could go down, your hospital system could go down, people could be prevented from getting dialysis to survive. Your financial system could go down. So it's a very, very critical part of infrastructure that we have to figure out a way that operates better than what it's operating today, because today it's way too complex and the efficacy is not quite where it needs to be.
No, I mean, I think you're dead on right with that. It is something that's going to be taking years for us to truly solve, but I think we're moving hopefully in the right direction,
We're moving
even
in the
though
right direction,
things are
for
getting
sure.
more complex. But yes,
And by the way, AI will help on that
yes,
dimension, you know.
that's exactly. So I'd love to transition to AI in the workplace and then part of the security aspect as well. Um, Maybe just taking a step back, I dare say it was April of last year that I really first had this unbelievable moment in time. I've been tracking this for years and talking about it to the extent that I was using OpenAI's DALL-E, which is of course prompt for creating
Yep.
images, right? And so I was giving a talk to some executives about this and the impact of just that, but saying, okay, where is this going to go with? We can do it with generative art, right? But what can you do with text or words? And it's only going to be a matter of time before that really kicks in. So clearly, in November of 2022, we saw that jump where OpenAI released ChatGPT. What I'm curious from your vantage point is how has that changed the workplace? Has it changed it significantly or not so much from your perspective at this stage?
You know, as they say with any kind of major technological shift that happens, you always overestimate the impact in the short term and grossly underestimate its impact in the long term. And I think that's what's happened. The hype cycle over here, people thought that within 3 months, everything would completely change. That didn't happen. But I think in the long run, the effects are going to be so profound that it's going to be hard for us to even imagine. And let me give you the core fundamental thesis on why. I think technology today is still far too complicated. You know, if you look at most people who are not as technically dexterous, they don't find this to be a very intuitive interface. You know, it's like you have to learn it. You know, one of the most intuitive ways that humans communicate is through natural language. You know, it's something that it doesn't require learning. And what OpenAI is going to allow us to do, and OpenAI was a great catalyst, but now you've actually seen many, many more that have cropped up where the foundational models themselves are becoming commodity. But what's happening is the value is being added on top of that, and it's all going to be around data. And what you start to see happen with that is that there's a intrinsic simplicity that can be brought to people because every user interface will no longer need to be you digging through a bunch of screens and menus to find what you need to do. You just ask the computer like you ask each other, and it gives you an answer. And that has such profound implications on technology in the long run that I feel like we are grossly underestimating its impact. You know, when you think about a decade-long period, when you think about a 2-year period, yeah, I think it's going to be, you know, there's going to be some normalization that happens, and I don't think that's going to fundamentally alter the way that people live. But in a 10-year period, 20-year period, you'll see some profound implications.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry. Please
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and the biggest one is going to be around democratization of technology, where many, many more people can use this in a way that with the degree of sophistication that it previously just wasn't possible. You know,
I mean, we totally see it now. I think it took a little while for people to sort of let that click, and this was a moment in time that changed everyone and their perspective for the most part on that front. So you had mentioned maybe the positives that are probably coming with respect to AI around security, but I'd love to see maybe a balanced component of that because it also makes me very worried with AI and security and Sybil attacks, proliferation of data, AI generated content, and human versus machine in terms of being able to develop and spin up viruses very quickly and easily. What are both the positives and negatives that you see, the challenges that are there, but also some of the positive that may come from this?
I mean, the positives are pretty. You know, what you'll see is far more specialization happen in the model. So, in order for every company is going to be every relevant company in the future will be an AI company. If you're not an AI company, you're going to be struggling for relevance, right? And so that's going to be something. And this is very similar to what happened with the internet. Most companies learned how to use the internet to go out and get to more people, to simplify things. And that was, you just can't imagine today starting a company and not having a website. It just seems very counterintuitive. I think you'll see the same with AI, and every software interface will actually have some degree of a prompt interface that's tied into it. But the big step function move will happen. How companies will be able to differentiate is, in order to be an AI company, you have to be a data company. You will need to make sure that the data that you have can be utilized to go out and solve problems that otherwise couldn't be solved in the past as effectively. So that's going to be on the upside. There's going to be a ton of innovation that happens, which allows you to use capabilities in generative AI to make things simpler for people and get better answers to people faster.
Fantastic.
The downside, though, and the downside is actually something that historically the tech sector has always kind of brushed off, and we can't do that anymore. And what I mean by that is, when there's a disruption that occurs, the tech sector has always said, well, that's just part of how society evolves. You have something new that comes up, and the old ways have to go away, and the new ways have to come about. What I think is something that we have to think about differently is the displacements of jobs that people will have over here is going to be non-trivial if you don't be careful about it for that period of time where someone had a certain kind of job, and their job now is going to be slightly different because of AI. We as society have to make sure that we can actually bring those people along, so that there's not this even more heightened level of disparity between the rich and poor. And I think that's going to require some degree of thoughtfulness on how you regulate. It's going to require a much deeper partnership between the public and private sector. And those are going to be important dimensions to think about as we think about protecting against the downside while enjoying the benefits of the upside.
So this is, to me, sort of the penultimate question. So there's a two-parter that I have coming up sort of to finish off here. And I'd love to hear if there's any other additional thoughts you have after this. But ultimately, was wild to me is that I try to watch all perspectives across the board for almost everything. But when it comes to AI and how fast and far it could go, there was one small voice that was on the cusp of things, and I was like, that's really, really far out there. Then all of a sudden, I was at a conference at MIT, and Jeffrey Hinton got up and basically shook the entire room like I've never seen. I've been to many of these conferences before, and he just blew everyone away. Of course, he's the godfather of AI, and he was retiring at that moment. He retired within the hours from Google, and he basically was worried about humanity going forward. And I think you've somewhat touched on this, but I'd love to push on a little bit more and say, okay, 10 years, I know it's very difficult to determine what could happen. None of us can really predict what is happening. But where do you honestly feel like this will go? I mean, if you have algorithms that people are working on around the world that can do all sorts of different types of things, and you don't have complete and total agreement across the board, all it takes is a few human beings in India or in Africa or wherever to come up with something, unless you have sort of like a Paris Accord moment where all countries are agreeing to certain models around regulation and use of AI before the genie's already out of the bottle. So how do you sort of control this type of thing, does that make sense?
I think it's I don't think we as a species know just yet. And that's why I feel like there's going to be aspects where this notion of responsible AI, where you think about the bias in the model, you think about transparency, you think about fairness, you think about security, you think about safety, privacy, all of those things are going to be pretty important, where we have to almost reprogram the human brain as it pertains to technology, where you can't just keep looking at the upside and completely ignore the downside while you're building technology. And the responsibility that each one of us need to have and bear as technology providers in this society is going to be far greater in the future than what it was in the years past. And that will also require that we need to do a better job at educating policymakers, because the disparity between the knowledge that a policymaker has about a technology and how quickly the technology is moving is in and of itself a limiter on how you can go out and have effective regulation that just doesn't become, kind of unnecessary bureaucracy that doesn't really lead to anything, fruitful. And so I think that public-private sector partnership is going to be really important. And I don't think society has a good answer, but the reason I'm optimistic about this is I do believe in this tremendous amount of ingenuity of humans for finding ways to do things that are better. You just can't go out and be completely careless about this one and say, you know what, we'll figure it out when something goes wrong, because by the time it goes wrong, it might be too late to figure out. And so I think there's always a 10% kind of paranoia that we all should have, saying, are we doing the right thing? And is this going to have unintended consequences that we haven't thought about, that we should be thinking about deeper before we get this technology in the hands of people? And I think that's going to be a shift in thinking and mindset that the tech sector specifically will need to keep in mind as we start to have these technologies roll out in the market. And we are certainly doing our fair share at Cisco of making sure that if there are certain things that seem tempting, but we feel like it's not going to be done in a responsible way, we will not do it. How customer data is used and policy around customer data is going to be pretty important, so that you don't violate, privacy for someone. Those kind of things are going to be more and more important as you move forward. But I don't think there's a clean answer yet on what do you do if something completely unintended happens right now. I think you just have to watch it very closely and make sure that there's enough guardrails put in place on the use of this technology. Otherwise, you could. There is a non-zero chance that this could go sideways. But I'm generally an optimist for this, thinking that there's far more good to be had from AI than there is the downside. And that's gotten more clear over the 6-7 months that ChatGPT and others have been around. On day 2, I was much more paranoid than I am today. But I think you have to keep the long term in mind.
I have, I think, over 300 different AI sites that I don't use all of them, but I've saved, and I'm going through them one by one, and some are just ridiculously powerful. And so I might be a little bit more on the other side of this, but we'll see. So time will tell. Final question, if that's okay. So what are you telling, if you have children, nieces, nephews, about where they should target their education going forward? I used to be able to feel fairly confident in saying, okay, go into engineering, go into this, go into that. What are you saying now?
So there's a couple of things that, and I have a 12-year-old daughter, and I'll tell you what I'll try to convey to her, but it's important you think about a couple of things before we do that, which is, I think it's going to be almost impossible to predict the long term the way that we used to, because of the rate of change. Scientific progress will probably compound at the rate of 1000x over time. And so it's what you thought would take 10 years can now happen within 12 months, 15 months. And if you can start to see that over time compound, it's very hard to predict a 10-year outlook. I just think anyone who does that is going to be, is going to have a superpower that most people aren't going to be able to have. And so what I tell my daughter, and what I hope I can tell my daughter when she actually gets to really understand what she wants to do in her life, is it's going to be far more important in the future to know the right questions to ask rather than knowing the answers that you need to have. And I think that skill of understanding the right questions to ask is going to be far more important than knowing the right answers. And that to some degree was true when the internet came about, because you could look up anything. And now it's actually going to be even more true with AI, because I think there's going to be, knowledge is no longer going to be something that gets rewarded, because that's just going to be available. But wisdom is something that comes with knowing the questions to ask at the right time that actually bring out the right knowledge to you. And I think that's going to be the piece that, from a career standpoint, the mindset shift that'll need to happen for the next generation is not over-indexing on the answers and over-indexing on the questions that you need to ask. There's one other thing, if you don't mind, I'd probably say that from a leadership perspective will be really important. And this goes back to our question on the hybrid work side. The next generation leaders will learn how to engender and build trust among each other and build relationships that are tight without having met someone in person. It is going to be essential for us to progress society forward at scale, because as more humans, populate the planet, you're not going to be able to meet everyone that you want to have a relationship with. But if you can do that remotely, like you and I, Joe, I don't think we've ever met in person. But I don't know why you and I couldn't actually have a very deep series of conversations and get to know each other better, and then over time even call each other friends. And the better we do that, the better off we're going to be as leaders for the next generation. We'll be more equipped to go out and deal with, being able to access talent from anywhere, being able to access opportunity anywhere. And I think that's going to be pretty important. And the combination of those two, what can happen with asking the right questions and what can happen with making sure you can engender the right relationship, those two things together can create some magic.
Very, very well said. I really appreciate those words of wisdom, and absolutely true. So thank you. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for taking the time as well.
All right, Patel, take care. Bye-bye.